with capital stock of $10,000. Business boomed. Literally. Compressed acetylene explodes easily. The company just kept changing locations. Percy Avery left the business in 1906, and the company's name was changed to the Prestolite Company. By 1911, the explosions had stopped and business was prospering. Allison's passion for quality led him, along with friends, to the founding of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1909. He had married his childhood sweetheart Sarah in 1901 and had served as vice president of his father's business, the Allison Coupon Company. Now he was to pursue his destiny. Good fortune abounding at Prestolite, Jim Allison continued to surround himself with quality and began construction of an elegant residence in 1911. The Riverdale estate took 2 years to build. White marble had been brought in from Italy. Each room was decorated in a different motif. In the same year, Prestolite's new plant was completed adjacent to the Speedway track, and at the suggestion of friend Johnny Aiken, Jim Allison became intrigued with starting a racing team. Allison and comrades Carl Fisher, Frank Wheeler, and Arthur Newby assembled 3 racing teams starting with the Indianapolis Speedway Team Company. The founding date was September 14, 1915. The company would later emerge as Allison Gas Turbine, a division of General Motors. A building was rented on Georgia Street, downtown Indianapolis, where the Indianapolis Speedway Team Company rebuilt domestic and foreign cars for races for 2 unsuccessful years. In 1916, Allison proposed taking over the company and building a new shop near Speedway. On April 17, 1917, the morning after America's declaration of war against Germany, Allison ended the Indy races until after the war was over to concentrate on the war effort. In 1917, the Speedway Team Company changed its name to the Allison Experimental Company. Under Norman Gilman's leadership, the company began taking war orders. Allison told Gilman, "Take any jobs you like, especially the ones other fellows can't do. Anything that will help us get started." A swift commitment of shop resources to war production quickly launched a flow of challenging design and manufacturing jobs. The most significant came from Nordyke Marmon Motor Company, who had government contracts to build both Hall-Scott engines and Liberties. By the war's end, Allison had built several hundred Liberty engines in-house. Throughout the 1920s, Gilman and his staff steadily shaped the company's mastery of high-performance engine technology. Surplus Liberties, stored in Dayton warehouses, shared with most of the era's aircraft engines a grave shortcoming: crankshaft and connecting rod bearings that routinely failed after about 50 hours. Norman Gilman's insight and new bearing design led to a series of Army contracts to retrofit the bearings to surplus Liberties, usually in lots of 1,000. One 1928 contract totaled $1 million. Allison's commitment to excellence prevailed. The steel-backed bronze bearing and the superior bearing technology provided spectacular improvement in newer power plants. Soon Allison was supplying bearings to the engine makers worldwide. This business sustained the company well into the 1930s. Wartime jobs had also given Allison engineers their first opportunity to explore high-speed gearing, a field in which Allison has remained strong for 6 decades. For much of the 1920s, Allison was the only company actively pursuing aircraft reduction gears and supplied them to Wright Aeronautical and to Curtiss, as well as for military development projects. After the war, the Indy races began again. Allison commissioned a race car for the 1919 race and won.
Eddie Ricken, as Speedway president, Allison, together with his partners, sold the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to Eddie Rickenbacker and Associates. Allison and Fisher then disembarked on a brand new challenge down south.
His large winter home on Biscayne Bay became a meeting place for captains of industry. As Jim Allison's zest for Speedway faded and his interest in Florida real estate increased, Norman Gilman began to talk of a solid product line for the company. Late July 1928, Gilman readied the Allison plant for a visit that would not take place. Beneath the banner headline of the August 4th, 1928 Indianapolis News front page, the obituary read, "After an illness of only a few days, James A. Allison, widely known Indianapolis capitalist and one of the founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, died Friday evening in his Indianapolis estate, Riverdale, on West Riverside Drive of bronchial pneumonia." Allison, 55, was widely known in the American automotive world and through his extensive business and real estate holdings in Indianapolis and Florida. Burial will be in Crown Hill Cemetery. James Allison's dreams did not end with his death. The lively enterprise that had begun in Speedway was purchased by General Motors April 1st, 1929. Corporate observers recognized the enormous potential of commercial aviation. Public acceptance meant aviation was entering the nation's economic mainstream. Some of the most influential managers at GM, including Charles Kettering, Charles Wilson, and President Alfred Sloan Jr., intended to see that the corporation was prepared. Airship shafting work for the Navy, Goodyear, and other companies led to Allison's earliest work with diesel engines 4 years before GM itself began development of the type. Airship engines had been a useful exercise in design innovation. During a meeting in May 1929, a special projects committee was appointed to formulate a business plan for the Allison Engineering Company. The decision was to build a modern engine more powerful than anything ever built. In June 1929, Gilman hired Harold Kominetz as project engineer to design an engine to be called the V1710. Slowly, the need for greater speed and load-carrying capacity gained momentum. Airframe makers and military planners began to appreciate the virtues of the more powerful, streamlined, liquid-cooled engine concept. 3 years later, the Army Air Corps engine people contracted for the modified XV1710-1 engine. The improved XV1710-3 engine was contracted for in March 1934. Test stand engines had continual problems. Starting in June 1934, Gilman and staff grappled with cracked crankcases, vibration-fatigued crankshafts, burned valves, fractured forgings, and sheared cotters. Radical rework was going to be necessary. Gilman requested support from Detroit. Ronald M. Hazen was hired as chief engineer to head up the revitalized V1710 team. His first big decision was to revert to conventional carburation for the V1710. Hazen's analysis of the engine resulted in determining two major problems with the engine: fuel distribution and structural weakness. Design work and testing continued on the engine. On April 23, 1937, the V1710 engine passed its 150-hour acceptance trials. America's first airplane engine to qualify 1,000 horsepower. Two test-bed airframes, a Curtiss XP-37 and Larry Bell's twin-engine XFM-1 Aracuda fighter, pleased the Air Corps enough to order 60 more V1710s. Gilman retired in December 1936. O.T. Pop Cruiser succeeded him. Pop Cruiser watched months of trials and tribulation with the engine. Finally, in preparation for the 1938 pursuit competition, Allison got the support of Curtiss managers who asked the Air Corps to fund one of the airframe builder's experimental XP-40 aircraft for mating with an altitude-rated C-type V-1710 minus the external supercharger. Although the competition was postponed, the wait was worthwhile. The XP-40 flashed through the trials 40 miles per hour faster than the previous winner. In January 1939, Lockheed's XP-38 dazzled generals with its initial performance, and after only 5 hours of flight testing, was dispatched on a transcontinental speed record attempt. On February 11th, the 7 3/4 hour flight ended in a crash landing on a golf course. P-38 flight testing was delayed for many months. The successes of the P-40 and the P-38 were not lost on military planners, particularly in Britain and France. By May 1940, overseas orders for the V-1710 had reached 4,000. General Motors President William S. Knudsen was asked by Secretary of War Lewis Johnson to build a plant for the production of the V-1710. In May 1939, a month before a 969-engine contract was awarded by the Army Air Corps, ground was broken for the new factory and office building to be known as Plant 3. When production began in February 1940, the Allison payroll had more than doubled. Experienced managers were going to be a priority.
Well, long about this time, the world was becoming a real volatile place. And as a result, an increasing need for the Allison engine was about to signal some real growth for the company. It was a growth like Allison had never seen.
In August 1940, Frederick C. Kroger, general manager of Delco Remy Division, was named general manager at Allison. An organization of 12,000 was built by December 1941. At Speedway, there was no pool of highly skilled labor. Much of the workforce came from the farm to the factory. These men and women were just beginning to fulfill their potential, yet they had made a gallant start.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
By December 7th, 1941, some 6,000 V-1710s were fighting in the skies over England, Africa, and China.
The war had brought everyone closer together, and Indiana farm boys, the ones who didn't go...
This nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
General Motors had accepted the challenge of building as many V-1710s as quickly as possible. Manufacturing became the priority, and the production line was ready in less than a year. The practice of subcontracting within the corporation was a long-established practice. The V-1710's manufacturing derived from the corporation, but Allison's conception, design, and operational aspects were solely its own. In 1942, Plant 5 in Maywood was completed in 3 months and 27 days. This wartime factory was 2 million square feet and covered an area equal to 20 city blocks. In 1943, 3,000 engines were produced each month, and peak employment was at 23,019 people. Building expansion continued practically without interruption. A formal training department for V-1710 service and maintenance was launched in July 1940. There were continuous model changes and modifications throughout the life of the V-1710. The original C engine was designed for the Army's P-40, the E model for the Bell P-39, and the F engines for the P-38s were designed and introduced without interrupting production. During one period, the average time between model changes online was just 40 days.
And just as had happened...
Patriotism, bond drives, plant visits by movie stars, the winning of the Army-Navy E Award, flyovers of fighters at company picnics, and ceremonies to recognize production milestones all marked Allison's World War II era. From 1938 to 1944, Curtiss built Allison-powered P-40s for the U.S., the Soviet Union, the Free French, Britain, and the American Volunteer Group. These Flying Tigers recorded 286 confirmed victories, with 12 pilots lost in action. Of all the Allison-powered aircraft of World War II, none was more successful than the P-38 Lightning. More than 10,000 Lightnings were produced in all variants. Early in 1943, the UAW made its first unsuccessful effort to organize Allison workers. On November 22, 1944, the NLRB granted Local 933 full bargaining rights in Allison plants. Allison may have been the last of the GM divisions to be organized by the UAW. On August 2, 1943, Edward B. Newell was named general manager of the Allison division. He would be elected a GM vice president in July 1948. He was a problem solver and a leader who got things done. At Allison, Newell's accomplishments included the inauguration of the Plant 5 manufacturing facility, flight test resources of Plant 10 at Weircook Airport, Plant 8 research facilities, the transition from piston to jet engines following World War II, and the initial work with Allison turboprops leading to their preeminence in military aviation. In 1944, Newell visited Wright Field, and Allison was asked to build a jet engine, the J-33. Theoretical knowledge quickly turned into production engines, and the Allison team inevitably made design improvements as the engine progressed. The first Allison J-33 was delivered February 3rd, 1945. Allison was now solidly in the jet engine era. The company's T-56 engine became the foundation of the modern expansion of gas turbine engine development and production. Even though James Allison was a man of great foresight, it is inconceivable that anyone could have looked forward to the events that occurred in one man's lifetime. His enduring legacy continues to inspire excellence